good morning, everybody. How you doing? Chris Roddenberry coming at you from Wake Tech South Campus. Good morning. Looks like we have a pretty good audience today. Imani, Dearica, Sarah King, Eli, Melody. How are you doing? Hope everybody's having a great day. By the way, Melody, how is your new program going? Go ahead and type in the chat bar and let me know how your new emergency training class is going. I hope it's turning out as well for you as you want. Everybody ready for the semester to be over? We have only one more week of class and then we are done. I hope everybody's excited about that. So I'm getting a little message on my confidence monitor here suggesting that my video is not coming through smoothly. How's my sound? How's my video? Everybody doing okay this morning? Am I coming through 5 by 5, as they say? Hopefully, yes. Can I get a great clinical start this week? Fantastic. Sound and video is fine. Fantastic. Good to hear. Good to hear. All right, so Melody is doing well in her classes. She's got CPR this week. Clinical start the week of finals. Oh my God, not enough pressure, huh? All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Remember, before we get started today, I am not a licensed clinical psychologist. I have just enough knowledge to teach an introductory psych class lecture on clinical psychology. If you have problems or think you need help, please do not hesitate to go to a licensed clinical psychologist. Everything I say here today is to be taken with a grain of salt. If anything I say does not conform to what your licensed clinical professional says, please feel free to ignore what I say and pay attention to your licensed clinical psychologist, okay? Just keep that in mind. Sometimes people look at a psychologist and they think, hey, this person must know everything about every branch of psychology. It is not my subfield, and I do not want you to think that I speak for the professional community, okay? Did I waffle enough? I hope I waffled enough to let you know that I'm not the professional here. So let's go ahead and get started. So if you remember on Monday, Tuesday, today's Thursday, on Monday, we talked about the diagnostic process, and I suggested to you that really clinical psychologists, when you go in to visit a clinical psychologist or a counselor or a psychiatrist, they're actually looking to see if you have a syndrome of behaviors, thoughts, or feelings that causes you distress, causes the people around you distress, is maladaptive, or somehow just doesn't fit in with society standards in a severe enough way that you might be diagnosed as having a psychological problem. Having done that, they then use a process of evaluating your behavior and thoughts and feelings. Oh, my nose is itching. I don't know what that means. I have allergies, to figure out exactly what pattern of behaviors and feelings your psychological malady involves, and then they give you a diagnosis. One of the diagnoses that your book is going to talk about in chapter 14 that we also talked about in Tuesday webinar is schizophrenia. And remember, when we do a differential diagnosis, we're trying to figure out exactly what syndrome of behaviors you have and what clinical disorder you have, and we're going to try to differentiate it from other clinical disorders which are similar to ones like that. And so if you look down here in the bottom left-hand corner, we have the schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. There are lots of different ways to demonstrate psychotic behavior, and schizophrenia, full-blown schizophrenia, is just one of them. We actually have a schizotypal personality disorder. There's a delusional disorder. Sometimes you might have a brief psychotic break and that goes away. Schizophrenia-form disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, substance use substance or medication-induced psychotic disorder. And then sometimes we have psychotic disorders due to another medical condition. I remember my father when he lost his leg due to cancer, he was in the hospital for like 3 months or something, and at one point not seeing the days and the nights go along, and they had all these medications in his body. My dad actually had a psychotic break for about 3 days, and he had to be restrained in the bed. I talked to the nurses and the doctors, and they said this is actually not as uncommon as you would think. And you know what? Dad got a little bit better after about 2 or 3 days, and then it never happened again. So there are lots of different ways that you can demonstrate psychosis. And what I want you to take from this week's lecture, Tuesday night's webinar and Thursday night's webinar that we're going to have, is that not everybody who has a hallucination or delusion should be given the term schizophrenia. It's really reserved for a very specific set of behavioral and thoughts and feelings, behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. All right. Now, so what exactly is schizophrenia? Well, people who are schizophrenic are going to have the hallucinations and the delusions that we typically think of with psychosis. They're not going to perceive things as we perceive them. They're not going to hear and see things that we hear and see. But that's only one part of schizophrenia. Now, hallucinations is a sensory experience that is not there. Now, remember, you can have a visual hallucination. You can see something that's not there. You can have an auditory hallucination. You can hear something that's not there. I mean, I imagine you could even have a smell or a touch hallucination. A hallucination is a perceptual distortion. It's a sensory experience that doesn't bear out in reality. Now, most people with schizophrenia are going to hear voices in their head. That fellow on Tuesday night, Gerald, heard voices that would tell him that bad things were happening and people were out to get him. So he was having auditory hallucinations. Most of your schizophrenics are going to experience auditory hallucinations. Now, another characteristic of a schizophrenic is that they're going to have delusions. Now, a delusion is not a sensory experience. It is not a perception. Instead, it is a belief. It's a thought inside your head. Now, here's the deal. We can all have wrong ideas and believe things that are not true. That is not delusional. However, if someone presents you with evidence that your belief is false and you are still unwilling to give it up in the face of disconfirming evidence, then maybe you are delusional. And you know what? There are lots of different kinds of delusions. Some people believe that they're being persecuted by others, that other people are out to get them, that other people are actually torturing or punishing them or making them suffer. And that's a delusion of persecution. Some people will look at objects and believe that somehow or another object or another person is thinking about them. A person thinks that they're important, so you'll think that this particular event has a specific importance that it really doesn't have. So maybe you might think that Costco is ground zero for the anti-spying network for the United States. So you might have sort of this particular belief that this object is important to you. You know what? Sometimes people have beliefs that a famous person is interested in them. So John Hinckley, the famous would-be assassin of Ronald Reagan, shot Ronald Reagan in order to impress Jodie Foster, who he thought was interested in him. He had sort of, if you will, a delusion of reference. There are some people, the very famous John Nash, who was a Nobel Prize winner in economics, also suffered from schizophrenia. And it is said, I read his book, and it said that he walked into his math class, his calculus class one day, and told everyone that he was the king of Switzerland. So he actually had this grandiose idea that he was somehow more important than he really was. So then some people have, identity, they think that they're another person. They have an identity delusion. They think that they're another person, that they're important, that they're Jesus Christ. So some people have these identity delusions. And some, if you remember the video that we watched on Tuesday night about the people who were gang stalking, they sort of have this mixed delusion that people are persecuting them, and they also have a fear that people are controlling their mind. There's another video I've got. A very common part of this gang stalking delusion is this they call voice to skull. They think that there are implants in their brain and that people are controlling them. And a lot of times these people will put on metal masks or metal hats that they think protect them from having their brains controlled. And so you're going to see all of these kinds of delusions or different delusions in different people with schizophrenia. And the crazy thing is we actually sort of differentiate sometimes people's schizophrenia based upon the types of delusions that they have. So there's paranoid schizophrenia, there's disorganized schizophrenia, there's different kinds of schizophrenia, and we typically think about it in terms of the sort of characteristic delusions that people have. Right? Pretty crazy, that gang stalking video. It's very, very scary and freaky. And you know, the crazy thing about a person with delusional disorder is if you talk to them in a bar for 10 minutes, you might not even figure out that they are having some sort of psychotic disorder. Andrea, would you say when you watch those people, those of you who watched that video with me on Tuesday night, did you see those gang stalking people? Actually, they seemed kind of normal, didn't they, in a way, until you got to their area of delusion? They talked normally, they seemed intelligent, their thoughts were all held together. Now, that characteristic that you saw in those people is actually why they would not be diagnosed as having schizophrenia. Not only do you have to have hallucinations and delusions, but a major part of schizophrenia is what we would call a disorganization. So their behavior is going to be disorganized, and their speech and thinking is going to be disorganized. When you watch the video of Gerald on Tuesday night, you should have noticed that it was very hard to keep up with Gerald's thoughts. He sort of bounced from idea to idea. He didn't answer questions correctly. He had these weird thoughts that would go off in different directions. He couldn't even complete a thought. And when he tried to talk, he did not make a lot of sense. So one of the characteristic things that you're going to see along with the deluded thoughts and the hallucinations is you're going to see schizophrenics are typically very, very disorganized in their behavior. All right, so the hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, and disorganized behavior, those are typically what we call the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. And if you look in your textbook, they're going to differentiate between positive symptoms of schizophrenia and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And this is important because the medications that we have for schizophrenia, some of them work on the positive symptoms only and don't work on the negative symptoms. Now, the typical negative symptom, and we typically say with a positive symptom, it's something that's added into you. The reason we use the term negative symptom is because it's something that the person typically doesn't have. And the person with schizophrenia is typically not going to have the emotional functioning that we typically think a normal person has. Sometimes they're going to have these really weird emotional flattenings where they don't really experience or demonstrate the kind of emotion that we would think. So we typically think of flattened or inappropriate emotion as a negative symptom. So your schizophrenics, not only are they going to have hallucinations and delusions, but they're also going to have emotional problems, and their thinking and talking is going to be disorganized. Sarah King's making a comment about the gang stalkers. Right in the question you might ask, Sarah, was, did being an outcast cause them to develop the delusion in an attempt to find a relationship, or were there weird and odd thoughts, those kinds of things that made them outcasts? So which came first, the delusion or the lack of social interaction? You're right. A lot of times people with these delusional disorders, they're not going to fit in. And this goes back to the criteria of having a psychological disorder. When you're not seeing the world as other people are, it tends to make other people nervous, and people tend to distance themselves. And so that's why we have sort of this culturally relevant criteria in the DSM, Diagnosis of Psychological Disorders. Part of what it means to be psychologically healthy is to be able to fit in with the community of people that you exist in. The belief in the reptilian aliens conspiracy certainly isolated the one guy more. Exactly. And you might say, what's the harm in having a reptilian aliens conspiracy theory? You know, it tends to make other people really, really nervous and anxious around you. It makes people not want to hang around you, and it can lead to isolation. Now, you might argue, hey, that's just society dropping its judgment on what is true and what is not true on you, and hey, that's a cultural belief. And does that necessarily mean you have a psychological disorder? Well, maybe, maybe not. But we do know that fitting in and living in a community is sort of one of the basic aspects of being a human. So yeah, having the reptilian alien conspiracy is a little bit odd, don't you think? And for those of you that are interested, I invite you to go back and watch the rest of that episode so you can also learn about the reptilian controversy. Now, again, one of the things that we follow in with psychological disorders is we try to understand what causes them and how often they occur. Now, the reason we do this is because if you want to know how to fix something, number one, we want to know the cause, because if you want to fix something, you have to know what causes it, right? If my car isn't running, in order to fix my car, I have to know why it's not running. So with all of these psychological disorders, research is always going along in an effort to try and figure out exactly what is the cause of these disorders. This allows us to understand the risk factors, whether or not you're likely to develop this disorder. And when we decide to when we develop treatments, it allows us to develop treatments which are more effective in helping the particular disorder. Now, incidence rates, when it occurs, who it occurs to, these things are very important, because sometimes environmental triggers in the world at large will cause these incident rates to change. And this allows scientists to sort of maybe, again, figure out what's causing these disorders and how to treat them. I was talking to you, I guess, on Tuesday, and I mentioned the idea that there's a new TikTok-related disorder that causes young girls to have these ticking behaviors that are very abnormal. Now, the crazy thing is, these tics that doctors are noticing, they used to occur in only 1% of their patients. Now, what they've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is the incidence rate of this disorder has spiked to almost 20% of the patients seeking help are experiencing these ticking disorders. 20% from 1% several years ago. This incidence rate allows us to see something has happened in the world, in our environment, that is affecting this behavior. And whereas it used to come on slowly over several months, it's now just dropping in on females. So the incidence rate in the etiology research kind of work together to allow us to figure out when these disorders occur, who they occur to, and how we can best treat them. Now, with regard to schizophrenia, what you're going to notice in your book, if you look at it, is that genes appear to play a huge role in schizophrenia. There are some behavioral genetics research studies that your book talks about, and what they suggest is that if there's a high concordance for people who share genetic material of schizophrenia. If you have an identical twin that has schizophrenia, you are 50% likely to develop this psychological disorder. I hear phantom phone vibrations. My parents don't experience this, but all of my friends have had this sensation since high school. That's interesting. Phantom phone vibrations. You know, that's an interesting occurrence. You're hypersensitive to using your phone, William, as we all have become. Whether or not that is a disorder would then go back to those 4 criteria that we talked about on Tuesday. Does it cause personal distress? Does it cause maladaptive behavior? Does it cause you to be less productive at work? And is it odd? And I would say that maybe all of us are in society are getting more sensitive to whether or not our phones are sending us messages. The question would be as to whether or not that is harmful to people in general. That is interesting. I would say the world has changed mightily in the last 10 years. Not only the internet, but the development of mobile phones and social media. That's interesting. Right, I know you feel your phone, but right, that's kind of an interesting thought. You know what? In the next 2 or 3 years, William, you might be seeing an article where clinical psychologists are talking about this. But usually, we typically only talk about these things if they start to harm people's functioning or make them feel bad. Again, I would direct you back to the criteria of psychological disorders that are presented in the first couple pages of chapter 14. Very interesting. I can't believe that is as common as it appears to be. Several of you making comments in the chat bars about the vibrating phone, but I could see where it would happen. Now, and you'll look right underneath me. This is the behavioral genetics diagram demonstrating the incidence, the concordance of schizophrenia in people of different genetic levels of similarity. So if your parents both have schizophrenia, you'll be 50% likely to have schizophrenia. If your identical twin has schizophrenia, you'll be 50% likely to have schizophrenia. If you have a brother or sister that has it, you are about 15% likely to develop schizophrenia. So we do know that it is related to our genetic endowment. On the other hand, I think Andrews Pappalardi mentioned this in webinar. There is this thing called the Dopamine Hypothesis. So it is thought that schizophrenia may be related to the overworking of your dopamine receptors or the overabundance of dopamine in your system. Now, this dopamine hypothesis is not well known. Here's the reason. We don't actually know which receptors in the brain are malfunctioning or where dopamine in the brain is malfunctioning. All we know is that when we give people drugs that impede the functioning of dopamine in their systems, their positive symptoms, their hallucinations, and their disorganization tends to get better. So when you give somebody Risperidol or Haldone or Thorazine or Seroquel or any other drug that impairs dopamine functioning, their hallucinations, their delusions, and their disorganization tends to decrease. And so it is thought, without a whole lot of biological evidence, that dopamine can somehow be implicated in the experience of schizophrenia. Now, although we don't know where in the brain these dopamine neurotransmitters are functioning and where it's exactly happening, doctors have spent a lot of time looking at brain scans to figure out what's different about people with schizophrenia's brains. And what you're going to find is that they have enlarged ventricles in their brain. Now, this wasn't mentioned in Chapter 2, Biological Psychology. I'm not sure why biopsych chapters don't mention this. But in your brain, you have 4 ventricles, which are fluid-filled holes that are in your brain. Cerebrospinal fluid is created in these ventricles, and then it flows around your brain, bathing your brain in liquid. Now, it turns out that if you look at, and if you do an MRI or a CAT scan, you can clearly see these voids in the brain. And what researchers have found is that there appear to be larger holes in the brain of people with schizophrenia. And what's thought is that maybe there was cell death in their medial frontal and temporal lobes so this brain tissue dies in these lobes, which makes these ventricles look a little bit bigger. Again, it's not great evidence, it's correlational evidence. And we don't really understand why that would necessarily cause schizophrenia, but it is another biological difference that you can see between people who have schizophrenia and people who do not. Now, one of the interesting things about schizophrenia is even though it has a genetic component, think about it, you have the gene for this disorder, but yet we never see schizophrenia before the age of 16, 17, 18. Now, there's one case on Oprah Winfrey of a child who developed schizophrenia. But the thing is, schizophrenia is unheard of before your late teens or early 20s. So if we have this disorder and it's genetic, why doesn't it come until later in your life? It must have something to do with your environment. So the diathesis stress model tries to incorporate the fact that schizophrenia is genetic, and it also appears to be environmental. And I talked about the diathesis stress model a little bit on Tuesday, but basically it says you have a genetic tendency towards a sickness, and what you need is an environmental trigger to kick it off. And what's typical, what clinical psychologists will typically say is that you may have this genetic weakness in your brain, but what happens is once you start meeting the stress of adulthood, the stress of this adulthood causes this particular weakness in the brain to become exacerbated and for the schizophrenia to begin. Okay? I hope that makes sense in the diathesis stress model. But here's the deal. We really don't know what causes any psychological disorder. Genes cause it? Yeah, sure, there's a genetic component. This drug that decreases the function of the effectiveness of dopamine in your brain makes the disorder go away. So maybe it's related to dopamine. When we look at the brain scans of people with schizophrenia versus the people without, we notice that there's sort of a characteristic difference in the size of the brain ventricles, and we know that it happens in teenage years. But none of these really can tell you exactly why schizophrenia happens. It's the same thing for bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder or depression or anxiety. I hate to say this, but there is very little evidence that actually allows doctors to say definitively what causes a psychological disorder. In a sense, we are in the infancy of psychological treatments. We are in the same place with psychological treatments where we were with medical treatments 150 years ago. And so it's really, as much as we know about psychological disorders, it's surprising how much we don't know. Now, what are the incidence rates of schizophrenia? Typically, it's going to be about 1% of the population. And did you know what? Schizophrenia is more common in men than it is in women. What you're going to find is there's a very interesting gender difference in a lot of psychological disorders. Disorders that we call typically externalizing disorders, disorders in which people act out and demonstrate their psychological disorder. In these types of disorders, you're typically going to see it more common in men than in females. ADHD, schizophrenia, antisocial personality disorder, disorders, conduct disorder, disorders in which people act out and you can see their psychological disorder. Externalizing disorders are more common in males. On the other hand, internalizing disorders like anxiety and depression, where the disorder occurs mainly in your brain and your thinking, and you have thoughts that cause you stress and cause you anxiety and cause you distress. Internalizing disorders tend to be more common in females. How about that? So males are more likely to be schizophrenic, but females are more likely to be depressed. Okay? Now, the other thing is you're going to see schizophrenia tends to occur earlier in men than in females. So schizophrenia is typically going to occur in the late teens for boys and in the early 20s for your ladies. Now, here's the thing. You might be asking the question, oh my God, I'm a 19-year-old female. Am I at risk of developing schizophrenia over the next year or two? Actually, no. Schizophrenia does not drop in out of the clear blue sky on you with no notice. Typically, there's this thing called the prodromal period, which is maybe a space of 2 to 3 to 4 years where the person's behavior, they start to socially withdraw, they become a little quieter, and things aren't right. So with schizophrenia, basically there's a long period where the person sort of descends down into full-blown schizophrenia. So if you're wondering today, am I at risk of waking up tomorrow with schizophrenia? Absolutely not. People with schizophrenia, when doctors talk to their family and friends, you will find that these people inevitably had a period of at least a year, sometimes more than that, where their behavior appears, they seem to have a degradation in their ability to function. So it doesn't just happen overnight, right? And in fact, if you were to exhibit schizophrenic symptoms overnight, then your clinical psychologist would be looking for other diagnosis. They would think that it was a psychotic disorder due to another medical condition. They might think that it was a substance abuse psychotic disorder. It might be diagnosed as a brief psychotic disorder. So typically, full-blown schizophrenia doesn't just appear on you overnight. And by knowing the pattern of how it occurs, that again allows us to diagnose it accurately. So William, if you're completely normal today and you wake up demonstrating schizophrenic-like behaviors, your psychologist, whoever the intake officer is not going to be likely to diagnose you with schizophrenia. They're instead going to say, you know what, the incidence of this disorder doesn't follow the right progression. So there's probably something else at work here. Okay? Now, there are different patterns for schizophrenia. Some people will have a single schizophrenic episode for several weeks, and then they'll get better. And you know what? You're going to find about 22% of the people do that. And you know what? Some people, on the other hand, are going to have episodes of schizophrenia, but in between those episodes of schizophrenia, they're going to show minimal impairment. And then you're going to see probably about 43% of the people who have a schizophrenic episode are going to show moderate to severe impairment in between their psychotic episodes. And we typically refer to these people as chronics, the chronic schizophrenias. And so there's a prognosis. There are different patterns for what your clinical psychologist is going to expect when you experience schizophrenia. Some of you are only going to have one brief psychotic period and get better. Some are going to have multiple psychotic periods, but they're going to seem pretty normal in between them. And then almost half of your schizophrenic are going to be what we would call chronic schizophrenics. Okay? Now, depression. Depression is or mood disorders, if you will, are problems with maintaining our proper, comfortable emotion that allows us to function. Where schizophrenia is a thought disorder and you have disordered thought, depressive disorders or mood disorders are going to where you have problems with your emotional functioning. And one of the major types of mood-related disorders are depressive disorders. So common, it's considered the common cold of psychological disorders. And I think what they say is that about 20% of the population at some point in their life is going to have a depressive episode, right? So what you're going to see is that at any given time, probably 7% of the population is going to be diagnosed as having a depressive disorder. As I suggested, this is an internalizing disorder, so it's going to be more common in women than in men. And again, we don't know exactly what serotonin receptors are malfunctioning or where serotonin is in the wrong amounts in the part of the brain. Psychologists do know that if you give a person a drug that magnifies the effectiveness of serotonin in their brain, their symptoms will go away. And so we don't know exactly how serotonin is related to depression. We know that if you give people serotonin magnifying drugs, their symptoms get better. Now, if you'll notice over here on the left, there are 9 symptoms associated with schizophrenia. Being in a sad mood, loss of interest in activities, sleep disturbances, weight loss or weight gain, difficulty concentrating, feeling like you're worthless, loss of energy, and lack of interest in the things that you should be interested in, and suicidal thoughts. These all represent symptoms of schizophrenia. If you have 5 of these symptoms for at least 2 weeks, you can be diagnosed as having had a depressive episode, a major depressive episode. All right. Now, here's the deal. Some people don't have 5 symptoms. And if you don't have 5 symptoms, the doctor's not going to diagnose you. But some people will have fewer symptoms, but they'll last for longer. If you have at least 3 of these symptoms and they last for more than 6 months, your doctor may choose to diagnose you with a related but different disorder. It's called PDD, persistent depressive disorder. Now, this occurs in 3% of the population, and some people may have a minor level of depression that lasts for 6 months and even 4 years. And so we typically differentiate those people whose mood crashes severely for a short period of time, as opposed to those people who just have this persistent sadness that won't go away. Okay? Exactly, right? And the problem with schizophrenics and the problem with bipolars is that sometimes they feel good enough that they don't want their medicine. Being in a manic episode sometimes feels good. And so you say, why should I be taking the medicine? That's a great point, William. You know what? Here's another thing. Some people who are bipolar, their mania gets so extreme and their behavior related to their mania is so extreme that they may actually look delusional and psychotic. Sometimes people's depression is so severe and so bad that their behavior seems delusional and psychotic. And so the weird thing is, a lot of times these behaviors will look similar. And so we look at the pattern of incidence, we look at your age, we look at the environmental things that have been happening, and all of these are used to help suss out the different potential disorders that you would have to find the correct diagnosis. So let's see. I have several friends who are bipolar, and all of them go through periods where they see something like, I feel 9. I think I'll stop my meds. Yes. You know what? And let's move on to bipolar disorders. Bipolar disorders are mood regulation disorders. So in a depressive disorder, your mood only goes down and stays down. With bipolar disorder, these people have trouble managing their emotional functioning. They go from really, really depressed and sad to these behavioral syndromes where they're manic and their thoughts are racing and they feel grandiose and they have amazing thoughts and aspirations that cause them to do things that distress people around them. People going through a manic episode a lot of times will not be feeling distressed. They might not be sad. They might be hyper productive, but people around them are distressed by their behavior. So you can think about bipolar disorders as people who swing from depressed states to hypermanic states, right? In a manic episode is a period of persistently abnormal, elevated mood, grandiose ideas, hyperactivity, racing thoughts, then a diminished need for sleep. Now, bipolar disorders occur in about 4% of the population, and they typically begin in late adolescence. In fact, I saw an evaluation of an 11-year-old girl who was having mood control problems, and the doctor made a note that her behavior looked like bipolar, but the doctor was unwilling to give her the diagnosis because she was a 10-year-old girl and just wasn't in the right age group. So he just sort of put a note in her paperwork that that particular diagnosis should be looked at for in her future. Now, bipolar 1 is typically diagnosed earlier than bipolar 2. There appears to be a strong genetic component, and it's equally likely in men and women. So what do you mean by bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, Chris? Well, you know what? Some people who are bipolar tend to be more manic than depressed. Other people who are bipolar tend to be more depressed than manic. So when you see these mood swings, your bipolar people, they're going to have periods of depression. But what's really going to characterize this bipolar person is how strong and disruptive their manic phases are. On the other hand, people with bipolar 2, they're going to have the manic phases, but really what's going to predominate, what's going to be the strongest feature of them is their great depressions that they sink into. Now, why does it matter? Why do we need a bipolar 1 or a bipolar 2? Well, the medication differs depending upon whether or not you're suffering more from mania or suffering more from depression. So people who are suffering from bipolar typically are going to get a mood stabilizer, the most popular one being lithium bromide, so lithium, and that's going to be used to kind of keep the mood from swinging up or down. But if you have bipolar and you tend to have the manic episodes where your thinking can get a little bit delusional, they'll add in an antipsychotic to sort of minimize the delusions when you are going through your manic phase. If, on the other hand, you're bipolar 2 and the thing that really is striking about your mood swings is your serious depressions, they're going to give you the lithium bromide, the mood stabilizer, but then they're also going to add the antidepressant to it. So the reason we differentiate between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 is so that the doctor is saying which medicine should augment the lithium mood stabilizer. Does the person need an antipsychotic because they tend to have periods of mania and racing thoughts that need to be slowed down? Or do they then tend to feel hopeless and have feelings of suicide? So we want to add the antidepressants, the mood elevators, along with the stabilizing drugs. Okay? Now, I haven't described the anxiety-related disorders. I talked about them a little bit on Tuesday in class, and I can't talk about all. I don't have time to talk about all of the disorders. But one of the things that I do want to mention are these things called personality disorders. And personality disorders actually used to be diagnosed on a different area of your chart than psychological disorders because they were thought of as being different. Here's the deal. Depression sets in upon a person who otherwise feels normal. Schizophrenia sets in on a person whose functioning was normal for a long time. But a personality is who you are, and your personality develops as you grow up. And so personality really isn't something that's separate from you. A person who's depressed can tell you that they're depressed and that they don't want to be depressed. A person with a personality disorder doesn't see it that way. They, in fact, have grown up with this personality. This is how they think, how they feel, how they respond to things, and they've done this their whole life. And so people who have personality disorders, it's really hard to treat these people because they don't see anything wrong with themselves. This is how I've always been. This is how I see the world, Doc. And so William mentioned about the difficulty of getting people on with bipolar to take their medication when they're not experiencing a down or an up episode. This is the same thing with personality disorders. Personality disorders do not typically respond to medication very well, if the person will even take it. And also, it's really hard to treat this because you're really treating who the person is. Now, what is a personality disorder? A personality disorder is any personality style that is so rigid, so extreme, that it keeps you from normal functioning. So it's okay to be a little paranoid. In fact, I think it's useful to be paranoid because people are going to try to take advantage of you. But if your paranoia is so extreme that you can't leave the house, you can't build a friendship, you can't build a romantic relationship, you can't build bonds with other people, you might have a paranoid personality disorder. On the other hand, if it's okay to be a little nervous and anxious. Hey, we all have a little bit of anxiety in our life. But if your anxiety is so strong and you are so worried about what people think that you can't build relationships with other people, you might have an avoidant personality. And so personality disorders, clinical psychologists typically look at because some people, extreme personalities, find that these personalities disrupt their ability to work, to love, and to live. Now, diagnosing specific personalities is difficult, so you can think of personality problems as having three broad typologies, if you will. Some people have beliefs and behaviors that are so odd that people don't want them around. Okay? And so we might call these people as having an odd or eccentric personality disorder. Now, it's okay to be an emotional person or to have emotions that other people don't feel themselves. But some people have personalities that are so emotional or characterized by such inappropriate emotions that we say that these people have emotional personality disorders. And you know what? It's okay to be nervous and to be anxious, but some people's personalities are so characterized by anxiety that we say that these people have anxious personality disorders. Okay? And so we can think of these personality disorders as having these three broad clusters. Now, people who work on diagnosing personality disorders like to think of personality disorders as being even more limited. And you'll see over here on the left, you have 10 different specific personality styles that are identified as being problematic. When you take a personality disorder test, yes, remember we were talking about personality tests last week? Well, there are these things called personality disorder tests that are designed to measure these extreme personality styles. In these personality tests, the one you might be familiar with is the MMPI, measures 10 specific personality styles that are problematic. Okay? Now, if you will, I'm not going to go over all 10 of these different personality disorders, but the question is, how specifically do we need to label a personality disorder to treat it? Okay, so is it okay and good enough to say that your personality is odd, or do I need to decide whether or not you're on the schizophrenic you have a schizophrenic personality style, which we would call the schizotypal personality style, or are you simply just a hyper-paranoid person, right? I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the borderline personality disorder, but borderline personality disorders are those people who either love somebody or hate somebody. If you've ever had somebody who went from your best friend to your mortal enemy within 24 hours, you might be talking about somebody with a borderline personality style. So is it specific enough to say that a person just has an overly emotional personality, or do we need to figure out if they are histrionic or narcissistic or borderline, right? And some psychologists don't really think it's useful to specifically diagnose these individual personality styles. And plus, you're going to see a lot of overlap between these individual personality styles. My youngest sister has BPD. Really? Okay. So that makes it difficult, I will bet, sometimes, Andrea, to have a relationship with your youngest sister, because she probably doesn't do well with disagreement. When there are slight problems or disagreements or little tiffs that will happen among siblings and between parents, she probably responds in a more extreme manner than you would like, and probably her responses sometimes make it difficult to be around her, I will bet. And that can be tough. It really does. She's very emotional also. Right. And you might ask the question, is she histrionic? Does she have just excessive emotionality? Or does she have feelings of abandonment? Does she have a poor self-image? Does she feel like nobody loves her? And you might ask the question, does it really matter? She's overly emotional, and does it come from her feeling abandoned, or does it come from her needing attention? Does it really matter? And psychologists will give you the specific label, but really, theorists might ask the question, do we need the specific disorders, or are the broad clusters useful enough in understanding and treating these psychological disorders? Okay, we are at the end of class for the day, right? And I hope you had a great time. I hope you learned something. Tonight, for those of you who didn't come Tuesday night, we're going to be meeting some people who have a delusional disorder. And we're going to be contrasting that with a fellow named Gerald, who has schizophrenia, just to see how these different disorders are similar and how they are different tonight in class. So if you didn't come on Tuesday, I will invite you to join me tonight at 7 p.m. so that we can talk about differential diagnosis and understanding how to evaluate psychological disorders. Okay? Anybody have any questions? If you do, please go ahead and type them in the chat bar. I'm getting ready to get out of my office. I've got to run some errands today. And then I will be in class tonight about 6:45. And I hope to see each and every one of you there. Hey, folks, have a great day. Thank you very much for coming to class. Take care, and I will see you next time.